Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths.
Shakespeare's tragic history, Richard III, begins with an end. The Wars of the Roses saw the English crown change heads several times over the course of 30 years, after a dispute over the line of succession led to multiple claims to the throne between two cadet branches of the Plantagenet royal family, House York and House Lancaster. If some of those details sound familiar, it might be because the history of these 15th century civil wars was inspiration for George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. Richard is a son of House York, and his family has just won the crown. Unfortunately for him, it won't be he who gets to wear it. Still, it's a time of celebration. A long era of war seems to have given way to peace. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments. But it isn't enough, not for our tragic hero at least. He was born and bred and made in the fires of war. He has a number of birth defects which disfigure him, and he's keenly aware of the impression he leaves on people. Such reception has left him with a bitter and resentful heart, and the only time he really felt the gentle warmth of acceptance and approval was when he helped to lead York's armies to victory. Peace will do nothing for him.
That I'm curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them.
If we take a step back to another Shakespeare play, The End of Henry VI, Part 3, in a soliloquy so chilling it'll make your hair stand on end, Richard declares that he'll settle for nothing less than the English crown. With brutal honesty, he announces his intention to kill his authentic self to achieve that end, to cry content to that which grieves his heart, wet his cheeks with artificial tears, and frame his face to all occasions. In other words, to lie, cheat, scheme, and even murder to get what he wants. This monologue is so essential to understanding the true character of the man who will become the focus of his own play in Richard III, that it really should have been included at its beginning, and in some performances, it is. The problem then is what stands in his way. He has two older brothers, the newly crowned King Edward IV is the eldest, and George, Duke of Clarence, stands in between. Edward is married and will soon produce an heir of his own, and on top of all of that, there remains the threat that some claimant from the House of Lancaster will attempt to rise up and reclaim power. Richard says it best, "For many lives stand between me and home." But all of this accounts for no great obstacle to someone like Richard, who is willing to sacrifice everything in exchange for a worldly good. Of course, like all who make the sort of Faustian bargain Richard has just agreed to, the prize is always less than what was expected, and what was given up, so much more. His first order of business is to promulgate a prophecy which causes the king to suspect that his middle brother will murder him. The Duke of Clarence is thereafter locked in the Tower of London, removing him from the line of succession and Richard's way. This is the least of his crimes. His scheming continues, and before long, he's king. Members of the court take notice of his suspicious rise to power, and in short time all the members of King Richard's court are incompetent or just as psychotic and power-hungry as he is. He's either murdered or driven away anybody that he could trust. To add to that, he's now inherited the responsibility of actually ruling the kingdom, a task which becomes ever more difficult when you have nobody that you can depend on. Eventually, his rule becomes so unpopular that many of the lords once loyal to House York begin to back another claimant from the House of Lancaster, their sworn enemies. All the while, Richard is becoming more and more paranoid expecting he'll meet the same fate as those who found themselves uncomfortably situated between himself and the crown. Kingship holds none of the splendor he imagined it would, and his life has become entirely devoid of meaning. I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown. Even in the very formulation of his twisted aims, he betrays his own ends. If his heaven is the pursuit of the crown, what's left for him now that he actually has it? Civil war breaks out, and Richard's defeat is inevitable. In one of Shakespeare's most beautifully written soliloquies, Richard is tortured by the spirits of those he killed, weighed down by his sins and despaired at the knowledge that his death will be celebrated by all and mourned by none. If you think it's beyond Shakespeare's ability to make you feel sympathy for a man as monstrous and irredeemable as King Richard III, you might be surprised. Shakespeare's tragic characters stick with us because of his vivid depictions of the internal tragedy. They're almost always the architects of their own undoing, the victims of their own misdeeds. As a culture, we seem to have this picture in our heads of the cold and calculating psychopath who is able to bend the fabric of reality to their will, getting what they want without punishment and hardened against remorse. It seems catastrophically unfair that people like that should be able to exist without justice ever finding them. Richard III is a reminder that no violation of moral law ever truly goes unpunished. In fact, the punishment is in the crime itself. Justice is served long before Richard's death. The battle is lost. Richard is isolated on the field, and by now he'd love to return his crown in exchange for all the things he sacrificed to obtain it. In fact, he'd give it up for much less.